Would the three of you like to tell her some of the things we've done? You can start with any part of the world and anything, just so that she knows some of the topics we've talked about. Yeah, from when to when. I mean, that's a big topic, isn't it? We've discussed the entire history of... No, we haven't. What?
From was it from World War, just after World War I?
Yes, it was from the end of... Yeah, we did. To the beginning of the Second World War we did, really. Do you remember some of the names of the presidents we talked about? Not necessarily you, anybody else can chip in. Yes, Daniel.
There was Woodrow Wilson, Coolidge, and Hoover. That's all I can remember. Oh, and Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, yeah,
There's
good.
Went back and went back.
Excellent. Any single things you can remember about those presidents? What were they? If you had to say in a sentence what they were famous for. Woodrow Wilson.
I'd say the formation of the nations in the end of the First World War.
Yes, at the end of the First World War, he was very much involved in the conference that took place in what city? Sarah Ann, Paris, to hammer out things like the League of Nations and all the peace treaties at the end of the war. So Woodrow Wilson was involved in that. Somebody said Coolidge, did they? Anybody remember what kind of person Coolidge was? Somewhere up. He had a certain attitude to government, quite a healthy attitude, I think, in many ways.
The government should keep back out of affairs of the country.
Yeah, that's right. Good. Excellent, you've remembered. Did his ideas work? You think not really? Anybody got any other idea? It is a disputed point whether his ideas worked or not. Okay. Coolidge. What about, somebody mentioned Hoover. What did Hoover have to cope with?
Hoover belts.
Well,
Wasn't there a depression?
there was a depression, absolutely. Caused immediate, straight away, first cause of it. Well, what is a depression? Wasn't everybody feeling miserable?
Is it when you get inflation and it's the after effects of that, nobody has enough money for anything?
I don't think I'm on shaky ground. You don't necessarily have to have inflation, but it's a problem with lots of unemployment, yeah? And that means people haven't got money to spend, and therefore they don't buy things, and therefore there's less made, and therefore workers are laid off, and therefore they become unemployed, and so people have less money to spend, and therefore, so it's a very bad cycle, yeah? What was Hoover's response to this as the President of the United States? Loaded question. Remember?
Did he make jobs through the government?
He did a little bit. He's accused of not doing so. The person who followed him, Roosevelt, was the person who said action and action now, and that the government should start doing what? Remember, intervening, providing jobs, government agencies, sorting out the banking system. Hoover did it a little bit. He's accused of of having stood back in the way that Coolidge would have done if he'd have been in charge at the time. Yeah, good, you've remembered lots. That's excellent. So that's America. Where else have we dealt with?
Germany and Italy.
Yes. What two great names associated with our studies in those two areas. Anna will not need telling that we studied Hitler. And who did we study in Italy?
Mussolini.
Yeah, good. So what other countries of the world did we deal with?
Well, we did a bit on Spain, I suppose.
We did one other large area of the world.
Russia.
Russia, yes. And we looked at Russia from when till when?
1917 to 1939.
Yeah, why did we choose 1917? Okay, why did the people who wrote this syllabus choose 1917 as a year to start, especially when looking at Russia? What happened in Russia in 1917? Anna might know this. No? He doesn't know. Oh, she's going to have a pleasant surprise. What happened in Russia in 1917? Sarah Ann.
There was a revolution.
There was a revolution, yes, that's right, and that's why it's a good year to start. We had to look at one or two things that happened before that, because when there's a revolution, you need to know why and what the causes are, okay? And then what was the great figure in Russian history that we looked at the end of what we did with Russia? Stalin, yeah. What did we think about Stalin? What was our overall view?
Murderously paranoid.
We didn't like him, did we? No, we didn't like him at all. So that's what we've done. We've looked at those areas of world affairs, and today we're going to start looking at something completely different. We're going to look at, before you say you've finished this subject, we're going to look at the two big international organisations that feature in the period of this exam. Anybody know what they are?
Well, the United Nations, the League of Nations.
Yes, the League of Nations was the one set up after the First World War, and the United Nations was the one set up after the Second World War. There are some similarities in these two organisations, and there are some differences. Okay? I'm impressed with this speedy note-taking that's going on here, Anna. You may take notes, you're very welcome. If you feel that it's easier to listen without taking notes, I can give you a handout at the end. So,
okay,
whatever you prefer. Okay, so we're going to start with the first of these organisations, which is the League of Nations, right? And to understand... Why have I got two here, which is all the notes about the United Nations? This is what comes of coming home at 2 in the morning.
Didn't you tell us to listen to the notes?
Ah, yes, you can tell me all about the League of Nations. That's what you did last week. I knew I hadn't gone by me. Right, tell me. Tell me, do. All about the League of Nations for Anna's benefit.
I thought it was set up by Woodrow Wilson. And it was the idea Woodrow Wilson was set up by all the European powers to try and diplomatically sort out problems between nations to prevent wars.
Yeah, good. That sums it up nicely. Is there a problem with this system? It sounds good, doesn't it? Instead of people fighting one another, you get hold of the two combatants and you put them together and you say, what's the matter with you? Don't you fight while we sort it out. Are there any problems with trying to do that?
Well, as you said before, you can talk to them, but if they're not very big on talking, then you can't really stop.
Courses in literacy required. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
What kind of causes of wars was the League of Nations looking at? What did it see as the causes for why people fought one another? Disagreements, genuine grievances, economic problems. Now, looking at what happened in this era with Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, can you say that there is another cause of war which is harder to deal with in that way?
Just want power and basic greed.
Greed, yeah. Looking at it from a Christian point of view, what other words would we possibly use? Sinful human nature, yeah. If you have a powerful dictator like Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin, and another little country there, and this big person wants this little country, are you going to be able to get hold of that big person and say, now you discuss it with this little fella here and you come to an agreement, maybe you can have halfway or something? And we've seen that failing, haven't we? We've seen it failing with Hitler, to a lesser extent with Mussolini and Abyssinia and so on. Yeah. So it sounds really good, but it's a very difficult thing to put into practice. Were there any other things that the League of Nations tried to do?
Weren't they trying to solve problems before they actually started by dealing with them?
Yes, that's right. Also there was, do you remember the Mandates Commission? What did that do? Remember what the mandates, or what a mandate was?
Well, the colonies in Africa and so on were owned, so to speak, by larger countries. And they would look after them until they were ready for their own independence.
And the Mandates Commission gave mandates to various European countries to, as you say, look after other countries with a view to preparing them for independence. Yeah? Okay, good. One thing that's interesting about the League of Nations, and one thing that constantly hampered it in even trying to do what it wanted to do, was to do with its membership. What was the big problem with the membership of the League of Nations? Anybody apart from... Do you remember, Sarah?
Was it one person from each country?
Yeah, it was. But which countries were in it specifically? Or which country wasn't in it? Can you remember? Yeah? America. After all Woodrow Wilson's hard work and his brilliant idea, America was not in the League of Nations. So the most powerful economic force, the driving force behind the whole machine, wasn't a member. And that was a big problem. Okay, now, what we look at today then, having revised that, is the parallel organisation which began at the end of the Second World War. Now, to understand the United Nations, this is certainly true of the United Nations, to a lesser extent it's true of the League of Nations as well, but to understand the United Nations you have to understand what humanism is, okay? Anybody got any offerings as to what humanism is? Anna? Yeah?
I'd say the belief that humans can sort out their own problems without any input from anything else.
Yes, very good definition. And specifically, what else? If human beings are going to sort out their own affairs without any help from anywhere else, where is the anywhere else that other people who are not humanists might think help would come from?
God.
God, exactly. They believe there is no God. And they believe that belief in God is not only wrong, as in incorrect, but harmful, that it does damage. Darwinian evolution is linked with humanism because evolution is an explanation for the existence of the universe that allows humanism to do away with the concept of God. Right? It's very difficult without evolution to be a humanist. So what is the final objective of humanism? Well, the humanist's final objective is a socialist world government with a humanist elite in control. What's an elite? If I said that you were an elite group of history students.
Well, that's...
Yeah, and the most powerful, and all the others would be down there somewhere, and you would be the top, the best. Yeah? So, a humanist elite in control of a socialist world government. In other words, the humanist intelligentsia ruling the world, yeah? Their vision is for the nationalisation of all industry. Everybody understand what nationalisation of industry means? Sarah?
All industries belonging to the state?
Yes, not to private individuals. Yeah, where have we seen that tried out? Daniel?
Well, communism in Russia.
Yes,
But
that's
in
right.
China.
Yes. And then, so nationalisation of all industry, first step. Then a dissolution of national identity as each government becomes subordinate to the super government, right? So this is the humanist creed, if you like, not just that belief in God is wrong and harmful, but also this is the positive aspect, if you like, that the world should all be harmoniously ruled together in a way with a humanist elite in charge. Now, the United Nations is the ideal organisation through which people with these sorts of ideas can work, and humanists have used the United Nations to the full. The United Nations objectives, which are outlined in its manifesto, and that of the American Humanist Association are very similar. So if you put those two documents together, you would find that they were a lot of areas in which they were very same. And the high-profile members of humanist associations have played prominent parts in the United Nations. There are hundreds of humanist organisations in the world. Most of them operate on a local level, but many operate on an international level through the United Nations. And this is particularly evident in one of the arms of the United Nations, UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Scientific Cooperation Organisation. And in fact, the philosophy for UNESCO was actually drawn up by somebody you might possibly have heard of, Julian Huxley, who was a very prominent humanist thinker. Okay? But we'll talk about that at the moment, in a moment. Just now, I want you to have a look at this chart, which is from Watson's book. Those of you that are doing the exam probably have Watson's book. This is a very useful chart and worth studying and remembering in depth, because often on the exam paper, sorry to intrude such a boring subject, but often on the exam paper, questions ask for similarities and differences between the League of Nations and the United Nations. So it's very important to get into your head its structure and its where there are parallel organisations and what the differences are. Now, if you look at the chart in front of you, can you see, looking at the United Nations, which is the second block underneath the line in the middle, if you look at principal organs, the first one is a General Assembly. Can you see that there? Then there's a Security Council. You can find UNESCO on there somewhere. I can fit now. Yes, it's in auxiliaries, near the bottom of the first column headed auxiliaries, UNESCO. United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation. Let's talk about the General Assembly first, okay? That works on a one vote per member state. It meets in September and additional sessions can be called. It scrutinises all the work of the United Nations, and a lot of its work is done through a committee system. In other words, issues that come up don't have to be discussed by the whole body. It can appoint committees to look at things. The languages used in the General Assembly are English, Russian, French, Chinese and Spanish, in other words, major world languages. Then if you look along the line, the next organisation after the General Assembly is the Security Council, which is paralleled by the Council of the League of Nations. That has a role of carrying out the decisions made by the General Assembly. And also it deals with all threats to world peace. And because it has to deal with these things that come up that threaten world peace, it has to be able to meet at once in a crisis. So it can be just called if necessary. When it was first set up, there were 11 members. This was increased to 15 in 1965, and there's a mixture on the council of permanent seats and elected seats. Now, the permanent members were the USA, Britain, the USSR, as it was when it was set up, France, and China. Now, because we haven't studied Chinese history, this will be hard to understand, but until 1971, China did not mean mainland communist China. it meant just the little island of Formosa, to which the Chinese nationalist government had retreated, and which was, until 1971, recognised as the legitimate government of China. So it was just Taiwan, Formosa at that point, until 1971. The rest of the members, the other 11 or 15 after 65, were elected members, and they were elected for 2 years. Any decision in the Security Council required 7 votes, which was 9 votes after 1965, and important decisions have to be approved by the great powers, that is the big 5, USA, Britain, USSR, France and China. So, 7 or 9 later had to approve any action, and the big 5 had a veto. And that's very important when we look at how the United Nations actually worked or didn't work. The Security Council, how it acts, it can call for sanctions against a member country, usually economic sanctions. Now, we've met with sanctions before, haven't we? Do you remember sanctions against Mussolini? It can also request the provision of armed forces which act as United Nations forces. States have the right to act singly or together in their own defence until the Council acts. So if you're a member of the United Nations and you are attacked, you can act in your own defence until the United Nations forces arrive. So that's how it's supposed to work. So that's how it works. The Secretariat, similar to the League of Nations Secretariat, is the staff of civil servants that make the thing run. Now, of the other agencies, I'm going to pick out UNESCO to talk about because it's quite important. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, and it was founded for some very good reasons. It was founded to campaign against illiteracy and to promote education. But what it actually promoted was secular humanism, and its philosophy was drawn up by Julian Huxley, the prominent secular humanist. Huxley states that the philosophy for UNESCO should be evolutionary in background, and he said, it's essential for UNESCO to adopt an evolutionary approach. The general philosophy of UNESCO should, it seems, be a scientific world humanism, global in extent and evolutionary in background. Thus, the struggle for existence that underlies natural selection is increasingly replaced by conscious selection, a struggle between ideas and values in consciousness. Now, I'll take that in. This is humanity arriving at its destiny, because evolution, in this philosophy, is what drives the human race to get better and better, by natural selection. This is the idea that once human beings are conscious of evolution as a force, then they can be in the driving seat of evolution, so that the struggle for existence, which underlies natural selection, is increasingly replaced by conscious selection. You see what that means? Instead of evolution blindly taking humanity forward, we are in the driving seat now, and so we consciously select how evolution is going to happen. Conscious selection, which is a struggle between ideas and values in consciousness. And then he goes on, I hope your hair is standing on end. From the evolutionary point of view, the destiny of man may be summed up very simply. It is to realise the maximum progress in the minimum time. That is why the philosophy of UNESCO must have an evolutionary background, and why the concept of progress cannot but occupy a central position in that philosophy. The moral for UNESCO is clear. The task laid upon it to promote peace and security can never be wholly realised through the means assigned to it, education, science and culture. It must envision some form of world political unity, whether through a single world government or otherwise, as the only certain means for avoiding war. So in other words, he's saying that UNESCO aims to take over people's philosophies and by education to change the way people think, so that they will be amenable to this world government which is going to steer evolution toward progress. In passing, it's very difficult to understand what progress might mean and who would say what progress was and what is better, why is one thing better than another and how you judge it, but that's neither here nor there. So he proposes that national sovereignty is dissolved so that nations unite together, a bit like the European Union, but on a world sort of scale. And then he goes on, he gets first, the unifying of traditions into a single common pool of experience, awareness and purpose is the necessary prerequisite for further major progress in human evolution. Accordingly, although political unification in some sort of world government will be required for the definitive attainment of this stage, unification in things of the mind is not only necessary also, but can pave the way for other types of unification. Right, what does unification in the things of the mind exactly mean? Any suggestions what that might actually mean on the ground? I mean, it sounds very wonderful, doesn't it? Everybody being harmonious and peaceful because they have unification in the things of the mind. What does it mean?
Everyone believing what they want to believe.
Everyone believing the same, yes. And who's going to be directing what we believe? This wonderful elite. Yeah? So it's quite a horrifying picture, really, isn't it? It's not a picture which makes any allowance for freedom of speech, not even a picture, actually, that makes any allowance for freedom of ideas or even freedom of thoughts, because it's things of the mind which are going to be directed down this channel. Right, so since UNESCO's mandate is educational and it promotes its ideas of world government and unification in things of the mind through schools, that's why it's such an important body, because it has this aim, this United Nations aim, and it has this educational mandate. In 1949, a UNESCO publication for teachers said, as long as the child breathes the poisoned air of nationalism, education in world-mindedness can produce only rather precarious results. As we have pointed out, it is frequently the family which infects the child with extreme nationalism. The school should therefore use the means described earlier to combat family attitudes. So this is school used as a tool to change children's ideas so that they're no longer in line with the ideas of their parents, where UNESCO thinks that's not desirable. In 1980, the General Conference of UNESCO in Belgrade adopted a resolution to include the principles of a new world information and communication order. This was an attempt to bring the world's television and radio news media together under an umbrella, which it was claimed was for the purpose of maintaining freedom of the press. The true reasons for this organisation became clear when it was then suggested that UNESCO would license journalists. So that's a way, you can see that as a sort of attempt to get information and communications under the UNESCO umbrella. It became evident that this was a step towards censoring reporting that didn't follow UNESCO's secular humanist agenda. So, in 1984, the USA and Britain withdrew from UNESCO because, they said, it politicised virtually every subject it deals with, exhibited hostility towards the basic institutions of a free society, and demonstrated unrestrained budgetary expansionism. In other words, it was continually soaking up more and more money, and you can imagine how Americans feel about something which pushes that idea of world government and control. Right, so that's UNESCO. I've dealt with UNESCO in detail because I think it's very important. The other organs are the Secretariat, we talked about that, similar to that of the League of Nations, and it's controlled by a Secretary General. Now, the Secretary Generals are appointed in the following way. A recommendation is made by the Security Council, and then the person recommended is appointed by the General Assembly for a 5-year term. Usually the person appointed is from one of the smaller countries in the League of Nations. Pause while I find the right page. Secondary General. Oh, yeah, I've got a page missing. Not to worry. The Trusteeship Council, that deals with what the old Mandates Commission used to deal with in the League of Nations. And it also has bodies within it which deal with human rights. And there are regional commissions for various areas in the world. The International Court of Justice. Now, matters which threaten world peace can be brought before the International Court of Justice. It has 15 judges which are chosen jointly by the Security Council and the General Assembly, and 1/3 of them retire every 3 years, so they're replaced on a cycling basis. The functions are very similar to those of the League of Nations Permanent Court of Justice. United Nations Organisation members have to accept the findings of the International Court of Justice, but some members have reservations about being bound in this way. For instance, disputes between Britain and members of the Commonwealth are excluded from the International Court of Justice because Commonwealth countries are all countries with the Queen as head of state, and therefore would prefer to settle any differences between them through their own systems. Okay? Trusteeship Council we talked about. The Mandates Commission prepares colonies for independence. It made new arrangements with nations that had mandates after the Second World War. For instance, the USA took over Japan's mandates. Most territories overseen by the Trusteeship Council moved smoothly to independence. Then there's the International Labour Organization, that's similar to the League of Nations, the World Health Organization, the Universal Postal Union, which is a very useful organisation, the International Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which you've heard about in the news lately, the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, the World Food Council, and so on. Differences between the League of Nations and the United Nations you can see from the chart. The Charter of the United Nations had 111 articles and was much more substantial than that of the League of Nations. It had the same basic framework as the League of Nations, and you can see a lot of the organisations were similar and had similar jobs. But in the League of Nations, all decisions had to be unanimous. And we saw how that constantly stopped anything being done. In the General Assembly of the United Nations, a simple majority and two-thirds majority for major decisions is adequate. This enables the United Nations organisation to act more effectively in times of crisis than the League of Nations had done. Other differences: the ideals of the United Nations organisation were similar to that of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, doing that, yes, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, and to engender respect for international law. But it also aimed to learn from the mistakes of the League of Nations. And one of the things that made a difference was that it was completely independent of the peace treaties. Remember that the League of Nations was written into all the peace treaties at the end of the war. That gave it an unpleasant taste in the mouth of defeated countries. It was like something that had been imposed on the defeated countries by the victors. This was not done with the League of Nations. It was very carefully, with the United Nations, it was very carefully kept separate from the treaties at the end of the war. And it was therefore not regarded by the defeated powers of the Second World War as an instrument for their punishment, in the way that the League of Nations had been at the end of the First World War. However, you can see that the great powers took care to preserve their interests and influence because they had permanent seats on the Security Council. Right, at this point, I will give you the rest of this stuff. Now, what I would like you to do, as Anna is here, have you both got the CDs at home? Can you easily print out the notes for today's class?
I've got the CD, I'm just not sure.
Okay, what about you, Sir Anne?
I don't know.
You don't know. Well, I tell you what, I'll give Anna this set. Okay, would you mind printing out notes if you want them? Because okay. For the moment, then, can you share? Turn to the back page, which has the exciting homework on it. Describe the structure of the United Nations organisation, and then this is the bit: what ways does the structure of the United Nations organisation differ from that of the League of Nations? Now, you could almost do that by looking at the chart. But obviously you will pick out these significant things from the notes as well. Second question, describe the membership and working of the United Nations General Assembly, the Security Council and UNESCO. Right? And then explain 3 ways in which the United Nations organisation is different from the League of Nations. So that's the same sort of question as the first one. So both the questions are similar. Answer either the first or the second of those 2 questions, but make sure you could answer both of them. Okay? Now, I know Anna's not in here about doing the exams, but before we go on to ask about questions about what we've been talking about, can any of you 2 potential examinees explain to Anna the golden rules and methods for writing answers to these questions? What would you suggest, Sarah Ann?
Always make a list of points you want to put down first, and then arrange them into a logical order.
Yeah. What is the method for beginners that we adopt?
Well, use a separate colour highlighter for each of the questions.
Each part, yeah. You can see, if you look at the questions, Anna, you can see they're always in 2 halves. Yeah.
And then just go through and highlight everything that is relevant and write it down.
Yeah. And join the dots and then examine question and answer. So that's method. It's useful also to look at what they call command words, like your mum was explaining to us at Kevin Lee. Here they say describe. Both the first parts begin with the word describe. So if you're told to describe, then you must describe, okay? If it's a question like, in what ways does the structure differ, then you have to it would be good to start off, the structure of the United Nations differs from the League of Nations in the following ways, yeah? So just make sure that if they ask you to do something, you do actually do it. Read the words that they give you to command and direct what you do carefully. If they say why, it's useful to remember to say because. Yeah? Yeah, is that right, Sarah? Yeah. If they say how, then it's a good thing to remember that they've said how and they want you to answer that question. How does such and such a thing happen? Yeah? If they say to what extent, they're very pleased if you say on the one hand this and on the other hand that. Yeah? So that you're giving them a balance. Alright, good. Any questions about what we've done so far? I'm not sure I necessarily will be able to answer them, but I can try and you can have a present of those. Done.
How much are we supposed to know about UNESCO?
Not that much. Not that much. It's just that it is very important for you to know that. You will get questions about specific bodies, and of the specific bodies, they're not likely to pick the Food and Agriculture Organisation. They are very likely to pick UNESCO. They're very likely to pick UNESCO because it's contentious and because it's one of the bigger things. They're not. If you look at the specialised agencies, I would say if they were to ask you about the International Labour Organisation, Food and Agriculture and so on, they would probably want not much detail. But if they asked a question on UNESCO, it might be like a third. You know how sometimes they say, describe these three things, A, B and C. I would expect that UNESCO might be one of those three. So that much detail. Yeah?
Roughly about as much as I was supposed to know about Manchuria or that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's the sort of thing. If you look at the second half of that auxiliaries, the peacekeeping forces are on there and the emergency forces. Next time, we're going to look in detail at the United Nations peacekeeping, because that's something that comes up over and over again. How successful were they at keeping the peace and giving examples? So we're going to go through some areas of the world and periods of time when peacekeeping with the UN has been a big issue, and we'll look at how they've succeeded or failed and why, and we'll do that next time. Okay? Happy with that? Good. Nobody wants to ask anything else?